He stands at the peak of success, surrounded by wealth, influence, and power. Everything he once fought for is now in his hands, yet an unsettling emptiness lingers within him. The battles that once defined his existence are over, leaving him with a strange sense of aimlessness. His name carries weight in the world, respected by leaders and feared by enemies. People look at him with admiration, but he wonders if they truly see him or only the empire he has built. With no more wars to fight, no more betrayals to overcome, he begins to question what comes next. He reflects on his journey, the struggles that shaped him, the betrayals that strengthened him, and the old woman who saw something in him when no one else did. She had guided him, tested him, and ultimately transformed him. But now, without her presence, he feels lost. The realization dawns on him. His entire life was built on the foundation of struggle. Now that the struggle is gone, what remains? He has more wealth than he could ever spend, more power than he ever dreamed of, yet none of it fills the void inside him. He watches others, people who work hard for every meal, people who chase dreams with relentless determination. He used to be like them, once. Now, he wonders if he has lost something vital along the way. Seeking clarity, he isolates himself from the world, retreating to a quiet place where he can think without distraction. He remembers the old woman's words. Power is not the goal. It is merely a tool. What you build with it, that is what matters. But what does he want to build? For the first time in a long while, he has no answers, only questions, and a journey to discover what truly matters. The sun was beginning to set when a stranger arrived at his grand estate. The man, dressed in simple but dignified clothing, carried an air of quiet confidence. He wasn't like the businessmen, politicians, or opportunists who often sought his time. There was something different about him, something unsettling. Without an appointment, the visitor managed to make his way past the guards. It was almost as if he knew he would not be turned away. When they finally met, the stranger's gaze was piercing yet unreadable, as though he knew something that even he, a man of power, did not. The first words the visitor spoke sent a chill through him. She helped me once a long time ago. Now it is time for you to repay the debt she left behind. The mention of the old woman was unexpected. It had been years since her passing, yet even now her influence reached into his life. He had believed he knew everything about her, but this stranger's presence suggested otherwise. Curious yet cautious, he asked for details. What debt? What favor? But the visitor did not answer directly. Instead, he handed over an old letter, its edges worn, its ink slightly faded. The letter was written in the old woman's handwriting, addressed not to him, but to the stranger standing before him. Reading its contents, his heart pounded. It spoke of a promise, a commitment she had made long before she met him. It was something unfinished, something urgent, and now she had left it to him to complete. You were chosen for a reason, the stranger said. She knew this day would come. The words unsettled him. What had the old woman been hiding? Why had she never spoken of this debt? And why, after all these years, was it being brought to him now? The visitor gave him a choice. Walk away and pretend he never received this message, or step forward and uncover the truth of a promise made long ago. The decision weighed heavily on him. He had spent his life battling enemies, overcoming obstacles, and proving himself to the world. But this was different. This wasn't about power or wealth. This was about her. And for that reason alone, he couldn't turn his back. The invitation arrived in an unmarked envelope. No name, no sender, just a symbol embossed in gold. It was unlike any offer he had ever received. There was no flashy proposal, no desperate plea for investment or influence. Instead, it was a simple message. You have been seen. You have been chosen. The world is shaped by those who sit at the table. It is time for you to take your place. At first, he dismissed it as a hoax. He had dealt with powerful people before, business moguls, politicians, even criminals. But this felt different. It wasn't just about wealth or status. This was something much bigger. Days later, a messenger arrived, calm, professional, and eerily well-informed. The man spoke with an unsettling certainty, as if he already knew the answer before the question was asked. You built an empire from nothing. You have influence in places most men only dream of. But power without direction is wasted. We offer you purpose. For years, he had been at the top, but this was a different level. They spoke of decisions that shaped economies, conflicts that never made the news, and alliances that existed beyond nations. They were not politicians, not businessmen, something else entirely. The world is controlled by those who understand its true nature. Join us, and you will never be powerless again. The offer was intoxicating. Ultimate control, knowledge beyond imagination, a seat among those who dictated history. But there was a price. Loyalty is absolute. Once you step in, there is no stepping out. Are you ready to carry the weight of true power? The weight of the decision pressed on him. Was this what he had been searching for? A new purpose? A greater cause? Or was this just another trap? One he wouldn't escape from? He looked around at the life he had built, at the lessons he had learned. He had spent his life fighting to control his own fate. The question was, did he truly want to control the fate of the world? The answer would change everything. He never expected to see them again. It had been years since their last encounter, and in that time, his life had transformed beyond recognition. The struggles of his past, the battles he had fought, and the power he now wielded had reshaped him into someone unrecognizable, even to himself. And yet, here they were, standing before him like a ghost from another life. The moment their eyes met, memories came rushing back, the hardships they had endured together, the late-night conversations about dreams and survival, the promises they once made. Back then, he was just a boy fighting to survive. Now, he was a man of influence. But were they still the same? Their first words were not pleasantries, nor were they filled with admiration for the empire he had built. Instead, they came with a warning. You're walking a dangerous path. There are things you don't know, things that could destroy you. The words unsettled him, not because he was afraid, but because of the weight behind them. This wasn't just a reunion. They hadn't returned just to see him. They had come with a purpose. The conversation that followed was filled with half-truths, guarded expressions, and the unspoken tension of old wounds. They claimed to bring him information, something about the secret organization that had reached out to him, something about the old woman's past, something about the choices he was about to make. But could he trust them? Time had changed both of them, and the world they now lived in was filled with deception. Were they here to help him, or were they just another test? Another piece in a game much bigger than he had realized. As he watched them leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that their return was no coincidence. The past had a way of finding him. The question was it here to save him or to destroy him? He had learned to expect betrayal. His entire life had been a battle against those who wanted to see him fail, rivals, enemies, opportunists. But this time, it was different. This wasn't an outsider. This was someone he trusted. The realization didn't come all at once. It started with small things, decisions made without his knowledge, deals slipping through his fingers, whispers that didn't quite make sense. He ignored them at first. After all, he had built an empire through resilience. He had survived worse. But then the cracks widened. One night, as he reviewed his records, he noticed a pattern. Resources were missing, transactions altered, private information leaked. Someone was working against him, moving in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. His first instinct was to suspect his enemies, but the truth was more painful. The betrayal came from within. The final blow arrived in the form of undeniable proof, a document bearing the signature of someone he had trusted completely. Someone who had stood beside him during his rise, who had witnessed his struggles, who had sworn loyalty to him. When he finally confronted them, their face was unreadable. "You should have seen this coming," they said, their voice calm, almost pitying. "You always thought you were in control, but power blinds even the smartest men." The words stung, not because they were wrong, but because he had allowed himself to believe otherwise. He had believed that after everything he had been through, after all the betrayals and battles, he had built something unbreakable. He had been wrong. The betrayal wasn't just about money or power. It was personal. A slow, calculated deception designed to destroy him from within. Rage boiled inside him, but so did something else. Pain. The kind of pain that came not from losing wealth or influence, but from realizing that no matter how high he climbed, trust would always be a weakness. Now he had a choice. Would he let this betrayal break him, or would he turn it into the fuel he needed to rise once more? The warning came too late. By the time he realized the full scale of the conspiracy against him, the walls were already closing in. His assets were being frozen, his allies turning silent, and the media was painting him as a man on the verge of collapse. It wasn't just an attack, it was a complete dismantling of everything he had built. And the worst part? His enemies had been planning this for a long time. Every step he had taken, every deal he had made, every person he had trusted, it had all been carefully watched, calculated, and used against him. The betrayal from within was only the beginning. Now a much larger force was moving against him, and if he didn't act fast, he would lose everything. He had two choices: run and watch everything fall, or fight and reclaim what was his. There was no time for hesitation. His first move was to secure his remaining assets. He reached out to the few loyal allies he had left, those who hadn't been swayed or bought off. They warned him of legal traps waiting to be sprung, of board members plotting to remove him, of enemies who had infiltrated even his most trusted circles. But he had one advantage: he knew how to survive. While his enemies thought they had backed him into a corner, he was already planning his next move. They had underestimated him. With time running out, he launched a counterattack. A hidden reserve of resources, a legal loophole, a move so unexpected that his enemies didn't see it coming. This wasn't just about saving his fortune. This was about proving, once and for all, that no matter how many times they tried to take him down, he would always rise again. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the truth became. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a desperate search for answers, a way to understand why all of this had happened. But the more he uncovered about the old woman's past, the more he realized that she had never truly left him. Her influence, her decisions, and her secrets were still shaping his life. And then he found it, buried deep in her old letters, hidden in records that had been carefully erased, was a truth he was never meant to see. She had planned everything. The proposal, the marriage, the inheritance. None of it was fate. It had been part of a design, one crafted long before he even knew she existed. But why? Piece by piece, the mystery unraveled. She wasn't just a lonely widow who had chosen a poor boy out of kindness. She had been powerful once, richer, more influential than he ever imagined. But she had lost everything, betrayed by the same kind of people who now tried to destroy him. And she had spent years preparing for revenge. But instead of fighting back herself, she had created something greater, a successor. Someone who could rebuild what she had lost. Someone who could finish what she had started. Him, every hardship he had faced, every lesson she had taught him, every battle he had fought, it had all been leading to this moment. The realization shook him. Had he ever really been in control of his own fate? Or had he simply been a piece in a game she had set in motion long ago? And now, standing at the edge of the truth, he had a choice. Would he walk away and leave her past buried? Or would he embrace the path she had set for him, knowing that it would change everything? Forever. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, led to this moment. The stakes had never been higher. His enemies had pushed him into a corner, leaving him with a choice no man should ever have to make. If he walked away, innocent lives would be destroyed. If he stepped forward, he would lose everything. His power, his freedom, maybe even his life, and the world was watching. The media called it the greatest downfall of a self-made man. His enemies smiled, knowing they had finally trapped him. His allies whispered in fear, unsure of what he would do. But inside he was calm, because this wasn't just about money or revenge anymore. This was about legacy, about proving that he was more than the circumstances that had shaped him. He thought back to the old woman, to the lessons she had left behind. She had been forced to sacrifice everything in her time, and now the same test stood before him. Could he do what needed to be done? He weighed his options carefully. If he fought back, he might win, but at what cost? If he surrendered, he might lose. But could it be a victory in disguise? The answer came to him not as a command, but as a quiet realization. He had spent his life surviving, proving himself, rising from the ashes time and time again. But true power wasn't about how high he could climb. It was about what he was willing to leave behind. Taking a deep breath, he made his choice. The world held its breath. And in that moment, he knew. This would be the decision that defined his name for generations to come. The moment his decision was made, the consequences followed, like a crashing wave. Everything he had built, his empire, his influence, the power he had fought for, was gone in an instant. His enemies had won, at least for now. The board of directors removed his name from his own companies. His bank accounts were frozen, his assets seized. The people who once stood by him, who swore loyalty, vanished the moment his power slipped away. And just like that, he was nothing again. It was a familiar feeling. Once, he had been a poor boy with no future, no hope. Back then, he had cried when he was forced into a life he didn't want. Now, as a man who had seen the heights of success and the depths of betrayal, he did not cry. He did not scream. He simply watched as the world he built turned to dust. Then came the exile. They pushed him out of the city he had once ruled, forcing him into hiding. The media painted him as a fallen king, a man who had flown too close to the sun and burned. Some called it justice, others called it fate. But he knew better. This wasn't the end. The old woman had prepared him for this. She had taught him how to survive when everything seemed lost. She had warned him that power was never permanent. Now, standing in the ruins of his own empire, he realized that he was being tested once again. But this time, he wasn't the same helpless boy who had cried on his wedding night. This time, he knew how to rebuild. At first, life in exile was brutal. He had no money, no allies, no resources. He was a man who had once worn the finest suits, now forced to live in the shadows. The streets that once whispered his name now ignored him completely. But he had one thing left: his mind. Powerful men fell because they relied on wealth. But true power wasn't in money. It was in knowledge, in strategy, in resilience. He still had those, and he was going to use them. Slowly, he started again. He found work, not as a businessman, but as a nameless laborer. He listened, observed, and learned. He built connections in the darkest corners of the city, places his former allies would never dare to enter. He spoke to the people who had been ignored, the ones who had nothing, because once upon a time he had been one of them. And then he found an opportunity, a small opening, a single chance to start over. It wasn't grand, it wasn't glorious, but it was enough. He took it. Brick by brick, he started to build again. Not an empire of gold and power, but one of knowledge and influence. He wouldn't make the same mistakes. He wouldn't trust the wrong people. This time, he would rise not as a king, but as a ghost, unseen, unstoppable. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was this: no matter how many times he fell, he would always find a way to rise again. Failure had taught him everything success never could. When he lost everything, he had two choices: stay defeated or start again. The old him, the boy who once cried over an unwanted fate, might have given up. But the man he had become knew better. He had fallen before. He had survived before. And this time, he wasn't just going to survive. He was going to rebuild. But not in the same way. His past had been built on wealth, on power, on the illusion of control. He had fought for a throne that could be taken from him, trusted people who turned against him, and relied on riches that vanished overnight. This time, he wouldn't make those mistakes. This time, he would build something no one could take away. The first step was patience. He didn't rush, didn't try to reclaim what was lost. Instead, he watched. He studied the people who had betrayed him, the ones who had stolen his empire. They had his money, his businesses, his influence. But they didn't have his mind, and that was their weakness. While they enjoyed their stolen victory, he worked in silence. He started with nothing but his knowledge and the skills he had learned from the old woman. She had taught him how to see value where others saw nothing. So he went to the places where no one else was looking, the forgotten corners of the world, the people no one paid attention to. And there, he found his foundation. He didn't chase power this time. He built it from the ground up. He created opportunities for people who had been abandoned, much like he once had been. Instead of chasing after businessmen and politicians, he surrounded himself with those who understood struggle, because he knew they would never take success for granted. At first, the world didn't notice. His former enemies laughed, thinking he was finished. The media had long moved on, writing him off as a cautionary tale of a man who had everything and lost it all. But he didn't care, because power wasn't about being seen. It was about being felt. And when the time was right, they started to feel him. Slowly, the cracks in his enemies' foundations began to show. Their greed made them blind, their arrogance made them weak. They thought they had won, but they had only taken a throne built on sand. And as they stumbled, he rose. This time, he wasn't just taking back what was his, he was building something even greater. Not a kingdom made of money, but one made of loyalty. Not an empire ruled by fear, but by respect. He didn't need grand offices or flashy cars to prove his power anymore. True power wasn't in wealth. It was in people, in influence, in the ability to shape the future. And when the world finally noticed him again, they were shocked. He wasn't just back. He was stronger than ever. The men who betrayed him now feared him. The ones who doubted him now admired him. And those who stood by him from the beginning now stood beside a leader who had risen not once, but twice. The greatest comeback wasn't about reclaiming an old empire. It was about building one that could never be taken away. Everything had led to this moment. The betrayals, the losses, the lessons. Every pain he had endured had prepared him for this final war. This was no longer just about revenge or reclaiming what had been stolen. It was bigger than that now. It was about the people who had stood beside him, the ones who had believed in him when the world turned against him. It was about proving, once and for all, that true power wasn't in wealth or influence alone, but in resilience, in strategy, in the will to survive. His enemies thought they had won. They had taken his empire, spread their lies, and convinced the world that he was finished. But they had underestimated him. Again. They had always seen him as a poor boy who had lucked his way into power, not realizing that survival had always been his greatest skill. Now they would pay for that mistake. This war wouldn't be fought with weapons alone. It would be fought with patience, intelligence, and control. He spent months preparing. While his enemies celebrated their false victory, he built his army in the shadows. Not just fighters, but thinkers. Not just followers, but believers. He gathered the people they had underestimated, the ones they had cast aside, just like they had once done to him. These were people who had suffered, who had been ignored, but who were now ready to rise. And when the battle began, it was unlike anything they had expected. His enemies had money, but he had strategy. They had power, but he had purpose. They fought to protect what they had stolen. He fought for something real. Every move they made, he had already predicted. Every plan they created, he had already countered. They controlled the system, but he controlled the people. And in the end, the people won. The world watched as everything his enemies had built came crashing down. The lies they told, the power they abused, the people they exploited. It all collapsed, one piece at a time. He stood at the center of it all, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a leader who had fought for something greater. This was not just his victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been doubted, betrayed, or cast aside. He had won the final war, but more than that, he had changed the future forever. He stood at the peak of everything he had built, yet he felt no need to claim it anymore. The wars had been fought, the enemies had been defeated. The battles that once defined him were over, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to fight for. But that was the point. He had already won. Not just in the way the world saw victories, but in a way that mattered even more. His legacy was no longer tied to the empire he had created. Power had never been his true goal, even if it had once seemed that way. What he had built would outlive him, but it did not need his presence anymore. It would stand on its own, stronger than before, shaped by the people who had believed in him. The world expected him to stay, to rule, to control, to bask in the position he had fought so hard to reclaim. But that wasn't the path he wanted anymore. So, he walked away. Not in defeat, not in regret, but in peace. He had spent his life chasing something: survival, wealth, power, respect. And now that he had them all, he realized they were not what defined him. He had been given a chance to become more than just a man with influence. He had been given a chance to create something that would last long after he was gone, and he had done exactly that. People would tell his story for years to come, not as a tale of a poor boy who became rich, but as the story of someone who never stopped fighting for something greater than himself. As he left behind the world he once thought he needed, he knew one thing for sure. The story may have ended, but the legacy would live on, forever. The true meaning of power is not in how much one possesses, but in how much one gives back. A life spent chasing wealth, influence, and revenge may bring temporary victories, but it does not create a lasting legacy. The greatest leaders are not those who hold on to power forever, but those who know when to walk away, trusting that what they have built will continue without them. His journey was never just about survival, wealth, or power. It was about growth, transformation, and understanding the deeper purpose of his struggles. Every betrayal, every loss, and every challenge shaped him into someone who could see beyond personal success. He realized that real strength was not in standing alone at the top, but in uplifting those who had once stood in the shadows with him. He had fought battles that should have broken him, yet he survived. He had been underestimated, manipulated, and cast aside, yet he had risen. But the most important lesson he learned was that true victory does not come from destroying enemies. It comes from proving that their vision of the world was wrong. They had believed that only the strongest could rule, that power must be taken and held by force. He proved that leadership could be built on trust, on purpose, and on the will to create something greater than oneself. In the end, he chose not to let his past define him. He walked away from the throne he had fought for, not because he was weak, but because he was finally free. Free from the need to prove himself, free from the expectations of others, and free to choose a new path. His legacy was not in the empire he left behind, but in the lessons he taught. His influence was not in the riches he accumulated, but in the lives he changed. Long after he was gone, people would speak of him, not as a man who conquered the world, but as one who changed it. The final lesson of his journey was clear. True power is not in holding on, but in knowing when to let go. A life well lived is not one that ends in control, but one that ends in peace, knowing that the impact made will never fade. The story had ended, but the legacy lived on, forever.